Arab millionaire traps his new wife in the basement. You won't believe what happens next. Hook. Sure. Here's a strong and engaging hook for your YouTube video based on the story. What happens when an innocent woman is trapped by a millionaire in a dark, hidden basement? When she finally escapes, who can she trust? The man who held her captive, or a mysterious stranger with his own hidden agenda? Watch to find out how this terrifying game of cat and mouse ends, and if she'll make it out alive, or if something even darker is waiting for her. Don't miss the shocking twists that will leave you on the edge of your seat until the very last moment. The mansion was silent, a vast, looming structure. The air in the basement was thick. Faint smells of old wood, damp stone. A single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows. She stood there, trembling, her hands shackled to the wall, her heart hammered in her chest. She tried to move, but the chains bit into her skin. The floor beneath her was cold. Dust clung to her feet. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her. She strained to hear any sound from above. Nothing. It was always quiet when he was gone. But when he returned, it was always worse. She had heard the whispers before, strange things he said, unsettling words in a language she couldn't understand. But his eyes told her everything. There's something dark about him, something she hadn't seen at first, something hidden beneath the wealth, the charm. Now she knew. Her throat tightened as she thought about it. Her body shook with fear. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape. But the door was locked. The windows too small to fit through. No one ever came down here. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her stomach twisted in hunger. She had lost track of time. Days. Weeks. She couldn't tell. Then a noise. A faint sound from above. The creak of a floorboard. Her heart leapt. He was back. She held her breath, hoping, praying he hadn't noticed her absence. But then another sound. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, slow. And then the unmistakable sound of the basement door creaking open. She froze. Her body stiffened in fear. The light above her flickered again. Footsteps grew louder, closer. She could hear his voice now, murmuring something under his breath. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. Then she heard something else. A phone vibrating. Her phone. It was buried deep in her pocket. The faint buzzing felt like a lifeline. She dared not move, though. The footsteps stopped. A shadow loomed over her. She could feel his gaze, cold and calculating. Then came the sound of a key turning. The lock clicked. The door opened. He stepped inside. His dark eyes glinted in the dim light. He didn't say a word. She could hear her pulse pounding in her ears. Her phone vibrated again. A message. She couldn't reach it. Her hands were still chained to the wall. The buzzing stopped, only to resume after a few agonizing seconds. He didn't seem to notice. His focus was entirely on her. A twisted smile spread across his face. "Are you hungry?" he asked, voice smooth. She didn't respond. He wasn't asking out of concern. His smile widened. "I'll make sure you stay well fed." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her. The room seemed to close in tighter. Another vibration. Her phone. The room felt suffocating now. Her chest tightened. Was there anyone out there? She had to do something. She couldn't stay here, trapped. Her phone buzzed again. Faint, yet louder than ever in the silence. She forced her eyes to stay on it. His back was turned for just a moment. A slight distraction. She leaned forward, straining against the chains. Her fingers brushed the phone. Almost. She heard his breath shift. He was turning back. And just as her fingers touched the screen, the basement light flickered one last time. Then it went out completely. Total darkness enveloped her. The air grew colder. She could no longer hear his footsteps. only the sound of her own breath, shallow and quick. Her heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't even unlocked the phone. Her fingers still tingled from the failed attempt. A sudden sound pierced the quiet. A whisper. It came from just behind her. She froze. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. "Did you think you could escape?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. The words sent a chill down her spine. She could feel his presence, right there. Too close. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out. But there was nothing. Nothing except the chains that held her. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. She couldn't even hear him breathe anymore. Then the air shifted again. A slight breeze. A sound of fabric rustling. Her eyes strained in the dark. She could barely make out his figure now, but she could feel him watching her. The phone buzzed once more. The sound of it made her jump. This time, she forced herself to reach for it. Her fingers brushed against it, but the screen remained dark. Was it dead? Had it stopped? Then, a sudden light. A beam from the basement stairs. The door creaked open. For a split second, she saw his eyes flash. He lunged forward. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the ground. She screamed, but no sound came. Her breath caught in her throat. And then, the unmistakable sound of the phone ringing. Louder than before. But now there was someone on the other end. The phone rang again. Her heart raced. She couldn't move, not an inch. She could hear the voice now, faint, but clear through the darkness. "Hello? Can you hear me?" The words sent a shock through her entire body. She didn't recognize the voice, but it was a lifeline. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the phone, groping in the dark for it. He was closer now, right behind her. She could feel his breath on her neck, hot and damp, his presence suffocating. "Hello," the voice repeated, sharper now. "Where are you?" Desperation clawed at her chest. She finally found the phone. Her hand closed around it. She lifted it, shaking, and answered. "Please help me," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath. But it didn't matter. The phone was dead silent now. The basement felt colder. The walls seemed to close in even more. He was standing behind her, his presence heavy, her heart hammered in her throat. "Who was that?" he hissed, his voice cold as ice. She couldn't answer. She couldn't speak. The words caught in her throat. Then something shifted. The faintest sound, a creak from the door at the top of the stairs. Her body tensed. Could someone be coming? The silence stretched, and in that instant, he grabbed her arm, yanking her back toward him. "Don't even think about it," he snarled. But just as his hand gripped her, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. A door slamming open. Footsteps. Someone was in the house. Her pulse spiked. Could it be her only chance? Then, a shout. A voice. Familiar. Where is she? She didn't recognize the voice, but it was too late. He was already pulling her back toward the chains. Her phone slipped from her hand. The light at the top of the stairs grew brighter. A figure silhouetted in the doorway. And then, a scream. The figure in the doorway stepped forward. A man, tall, imposing, his face hard but familiar. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was him, the one who had been calling her, the one who had answered the phone. His eyes locked onto hers. They were calm, but piercing. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low, steady. But she didn't believe him. Not yet. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Closer. The basement door was still locked. For now. But how long would that last? "Who are you?" she whispered, barely able to speak. He stepped further into the hallway, blocking her path. There was no escape. "I'm the one who's been looking for you," he replied, his eyes scanning her face. "You didn't think you were alone, did you?" Her pulse quickened. Her mind was spinning. Was he with the man who had locked her away? Was he here to help? Or had he been part of it all along? I don't understand, she breathed, tears starting to sting her eyes. What's happening? Why was I locked down there? Before he could answer, a crash echoed from the basement. The door splintered. The man behind her, the one who had kept her captive, he was coming. The mysterious figure reached for her arm. Come with me. Now, she didn't have time to think. He pulled her toward a side door she hadn't noticed before. There was no time to question him. She followed. Her feet barely touched the ground as they moved quickly. Her heart thudded in her chest, threatening to burst out. They reached the door, but then a loud bang shook the walls. The basement door was wide open now, and the man was coming up the stairs. She could hear him, hear his heavy, deliberate footsteps. The stranger pushed her through the door. Run. Her body obeyed. She didn't look back. Her mind screamed with confusion, but she ran faster. Her feet pounded against the floor, the sound of her shoes echoing through the hall. She didn't dare look back. The door slammed shut behind her, and for a moment she was in complete darkness again. The stranger's hand was on her arm, pulling her through a narrow corridor. There was a faint light ahead, a dim glow flickering in the distance. Keep moving, he urged, his voice low but urgent. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart racing faster than ever. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Where was she? What was this place? The light ahead grew stronger. They reached the end of the corridor, and the stranger pushed open a door. They stepped into a small room. There was nothing in it but an old wooden table and a couple of chairs. Sit, he commanded, his voice firm but not unkind. She hesitated for a moment, but then obeyed. Her legs were shaking too badly to stand. The stranger paced across the room, his eyes never leaving her. He was watching her closely, as if measuring her every move. Why didn't you help me sooner? Her voice cracked, her throat dry from the panic and fear. He paused, his eyes softening just a fraction. I was trying to get to you, but I had to wait for the right moment. The right moment. She didn't understand. Why didn't you just call the police? He shook his head. No one would have believed you. Her mind spun. Everything was happening so fast. I'm not with him, he continued, as if reading her thoughts. You have to trust me. She swallowed hard. Her body was still trembling, but she nodded. Before she could say anything more, the sound of footsteps, heavy, purposeful, echoed down the hallway. He looked at her one last time. Stay here. Don't make a sound. Then he turned toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. She didn't move, not an inch. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then the door to the room swung open again. The door creaked open slowly. She held her breath, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. The stranger was still, standing by the door, his back to her. A figure stepped inside. It was him, the man who had kept her locked in the basement. His cold eyes locked onto hers immediately. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. She could feel the tension between them, thick and suffocating. The stranger didn't move. The man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving her face. What is she doing here? The man demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The stranger remained calm, almost too calm. I was making sure she's safe. The man's gaze flicked to him. There's no need for that. His voice was full of ice, and for a second, she could see the malice beneath the surface. I'll take care of her now, he added, his tone final. The stranger didn't respond, but she saw his hand twitch, as if ready to act. She didn't know who to trust. She didn't know if either of them could save her. But something inside her told her to move. Before she could think, her body reacted. She stood quickly, her legs shaky but determined. The man's eyes locked onto hers once again, and in that instant, she knew she had to run. She bolted past them, toward the door. The man reached out, but she was faster. She could feel his fingers graze her arm, but she wrenched herself free, slamming the door behind her. The corridor stretched out ahead, dark and narrow. She didn't know where it led, but she couldn't stop now. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her body ached with the effort. She turned a corner, her eyes straining to see in the dim light. Another door appeared. She flung it open without thinking, and found herself standing at the edge of a cliff, a sheer drop, the wind howling around her. Her pulse raced. There was no way back. The footsteps were closing in. She didn't have much time. The wind howled in her ears. The drop below endless. A sheer cliff stretching into darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest. The sound deafening. She looked behind her, just as the footsteps grew louder. He was almost there. There was no way back. No way to turn. She felt the edge of the cliff beneath her feet, the ground crumbling slightly with every step. A sudden gust of wind threatened to knock her off balance. Her breath caught in her throat. What could she do? Her eyes darted around, desperate for an escape. Then, her gaze locked onto something. A rope. It was dangling from a ledge above. Her pulse skipped. There was a way out. She reached up, grasping for it. Her fingers brushed against the frayed edges, and with a final effort, she yanked it down. It was long enough. She tied it quickly, her hands trembling from the cold and fear. Behind her, she heard him, the man, his voice now loud and furious. "Get back here," he yelled. But she didn't hesitate. She swung the rope over the edge, her heart racing as she tested its strength. The wind howled around her, whipping her hair in every direction. She had no choice. Without looking back, she climbed over the edge, gripping the rope tightly. Her arms burned with the effort. The rope swayed dangerously beneath her, but she kept moving. Down, down. Every second felt like an eternity. The sound of his shouts faded, but her grip on the rope tightened with every passing moment. Finally, her feet touched solid ground. She stumbled, almost falling, but caught herself just in time. Her body was shaking uncontrollably now, adrenaline surging through her veins. She looked around. She was in a dense forest, dark trees stretching above her, blocking out most of the moonlight. But she was free. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. She didn't know where she was, but she didn't care. She started running. Her legs moved instinctively, pounding the ground beneath her. The forest around her was thick, the trees pressing in, branches reaching like skeletal hands. Her breath was ragged, her chest tight with fear and exhaustion. She couldn't stop. Not now. Every step felt like it took her further from him. But she knew she couldn't outrun him forever. The darkness around her seemed to close in, shadows shifting in the corners of her vision. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent her heart racing. Her mind was in overdrive. What was she running from? What was real anymore? The man, the stranger. Who could she trust? A sudden rustling behind her snapped her back to reality. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing. The wind howled again, the branches above creaking like old bones. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She forced herself to keep moving. She needed to find shelter. Something. Her eyes scanned the dark forest, searching for anything that could offer safety. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A small cabin, barely visible through the trees, but it was there. Hope surged through her. She sprinted toward it, her legs burning with the effort. As she got closer, she could see the cabin more clearly. Its windows were dark, but the door stood slightly ajar. She didn't hesitate. She rushed inside. The air inside was thick and musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. Dust particles swirled in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the walls. Her breath was still quick, her body trembling with exhaustion. She leaned against the door, sliding down to the floor. She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, but the silence felt oppressive. And then, a soft creak. She froze. Her eyes snapped open. The door. It was slowly, steadily closing. The door creaked louder, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. Her body went rigid, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't dare move, not even a breath. The door clicked shut with a finality that sent a chill down her spine. The room was plunged into near darkness. She strained her ears. Nothing. Her pulse throbbed in her ears, each beat louder than the last. Was it him? The man from the basement? She couldn't hear footsteps, just the eerie silence. Her hands shook as she pulled herself up, slowly, carefully, toward the far corner of the cabin. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but she knew that would only make things worse. The air was thick with dread. The silence was unbearable. She moved towards a small window at the back of the cabin, peeking through the grime-covered glass. The forest outside was still, unmoving. She didn't see anything, no one, but her instincts told her she wasn't alone. Her eyes darted back to the door. Was he watching her? Had he followed her into the cabin? The creak of a floorboard broke the stillness. She froze again. A shadow moved across the cabin floor. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no way out. Her heart thudded in her chest, louder than ever. The shadow moved closer, a figure emerging from the darkness. It wasn't the man. It was the stranger. She gasped. He stepped forward, his eyes locking with hers. "You're safe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Her body trembled with relief and confusion, but something in his eyes made her hesitate. "Why?" she managed to whisper. Why did you help me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, his gaze shifted towards the door, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, quietly, he said, "Because he's not the only one looking for you." Her blood ran cold. Before she could react, there was a knock at the door. The knock echoed through the cabin, sharp and deliberate. Her heart lurched in her chest. It was soft, but it felt like a warning. The stranger's eyes flicked to the door, then back to her, his expression unreadable. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice urgent. She nodded, her body frozen, every instinct screaming at her to run. But the fear kept her rooted in place. Another knock, this time louder. Her breath caught. Her mind raced, a blur of thoughts. Who was it? The stranger moved silently, his body tense, ready. She wanted to speak, ask him what was going on, but her throat closed up. She couldn't make a sound. The knock came again, this time followed by a voice, low but unmistakable. "Let me in." It was his voice, the man from the basement. Her chest tightened, her pulse quickened. He had found her. The stranger didn't move immediately. His gaze was fixed on the door, his expression darkening. Then, without a word, he stepped toward the window, glancing outside. Nothing. "Stay back," he whispered, motioning for her to retreat into the shadows of the room. She obeyed, her heart hammering in her chest. He moved quietly to the door, his fingers brushing the handle. The knock came again, harder this time. The man's voice followed, louder. "Open up. I know you're in there." She could hear the anger in his tone, the desperation. The stranger glanced over his shoulder, his face a mask of calm. "Stay low," he said, his voice a low hiss. The door trembled with another forceful knock, but the stranger didn't open it. Instead, he reached for something hidden beneath his jacket. A gun. Her breath caught. She didn't know if he would use it, but she had no choice but to trust him. "Are you going to let me in?" the man outside asked, his voice colder, more menacing. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, motioning to her to remain silent. She crouched, heart in her throat. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. And then, the silence broke. The night outside was unnervingly still. The wind had stopped, but her heart kept pounding. Her fingers clenched into fists, her breath shallow. She felt the weight of every second, pressing down on her. She couldn't keep running forever. The stranger was watching her, his face unreadable once more. "Why are they after me?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. He didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to the door, then back to her. "I don't know all the details," he finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "But I know they'll stop at nothing to get you." She swallowed hard. "What do they want with me?" His gaze darkened. "They think you know something. Something dangerous." Her mind raced. What could she possibly know that was so important? But before she could ask, he moved to the window, peering through the grime-covered glass. "They're coming back," he muttered. Her heart skipped a beat. She stepped forward, her hands trembling. "How long do we have?" The stranger didn't answer right away. He was listening. And then, without warning, he grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to leave. Now." She barely had time to react. He was pulling her toward the door. The cabin felt suffocating, and the forest outside seemed even darker now. Her mind was racing. She wanted to ask him what was happening, but her mouth went dry. The door creaked open, and the night air hit her like a wall. The stranger led her into the woods, his steps quick and sure. Her legs were sore, her body on the edge of collapse. But she couldn't stop. The sound of distant voices echoed through the trees. They were getting closer. The stranger's hand tightened around hers, pulling her faster. Every step felt like it might be her last, but she kept going. She had no choice. The trees around her blurred, their shadows stretching long and twisted. The ground beneath her feet became uneven, rocky, treacherous. The voices grew louder, and she could hear the crack of branches, the snap of twigs. They were close. The stranger stopped suddenly, his grip loosening. "We need to hide," he whispered urgently. They dove into a small thicket of trees, the underbrush thick and hiding them in darkness. Her heart was in her throat, the fear crawling under her skin. She tried to steady her breathing, but it was impossible. Through the thick trees, she could see figures moving. They were almost there. The stranger pulled her closer, his hand covering her mouth. "Stay quiet," he breathed, his voice tense. She nodded, her mind racing. And then the figures emerged from the forest. The figures moved silently, their forms barely visible in the darkness. Her heart was a hammer in her chest, pounding so loudly she feared they could hear it. She pressed her back against the rough bark of the tree, feeling every inch of her body tense with fear. The stranger beside her was still, his breath shallow. He didn't make a sound. The group of figures walked past them, mere feet away. Their faces were masked, shrouded in darkness, but the danger in their presence was undeniable. She could hear their murmurs, low and indistinct. They were searching, moving quickly. One of them stopped, her breath caught in her throat. The figure turned, scanning the area. It was a man, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the trees. For a long, agonizing moment, he stood still, unmoving. She held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice them. But then, he turned away. The group continued moving, their footsteps fading as they disappeared into the forest. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The stranger didn't move for several seconds, his body tense, his eyes still fixed on the distant figures. When he was sure they were gone, he slowly released his grip on her mouth. "Stay close," he whispered. She nodded, too afraid to speak. He led her deeper into the woods, moving faster now. Her legs burned with the effort, but she forced herself to keep up. The trees around them seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing them whole. She wanted to ask him what was happening, but the words stuck in her throat. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of running, they reached a small clearing. The stranger paused, his eyes scanning the area. He turned to her, his expression hard. "They're not far behind," he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge of urgency to it. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, a noise from behind them froze her in place. A crack of a branch. Someone was there. The stranger pulled her close, his hand covering her mouth again. She could feel her heart racing, her body rigid with fear. They weren't alone anymore. The crack of the branch echoed through the clearing, sharp and clear in the silence of the night. She froze, her body stiff with fear. The stranger's grip tightened around her, his fingers pressing into her skin like a vice. She could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, coming from behind them. Her breath was shallow, barely a whisper. "Stay quiet," the stranger muttered, his voice low and urgent. She nodded, her heart pounding in her throat. They were so close. She could feel the warmth of his body against hers, but it did little to ease the cold fear that gripped her. The footsteps stopped. She could hear them standing there, just behind the trees, waiting. She wanted to look, to see who it was, but she dared not move. Her mind was spinning. Who was out there? Was it him? Was it the man who had kept her locked in the basement? The stranger's hand was still over her mouth, his body pressed close to hers, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed ahead, watching the edge of the clearing. The silence stretched on, long and suffocating. Then, a voice. It was low, gravelly. "Come out," the voice called, slow and deliberate. "We know you're here." Her blood ran cold. The voice sounded too familiar. Her body stiffened as the realization hit her. It was him, the man who had kept her locked away. The stranger beside her didn't move. He didn't flinch. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice tight. She barely nodded, her entire body trembling with fear. The man's voice cut through the silence again. "Closer this time. I'll give you one more chance," he said, his tone chilling. The stranger's hand dropped from her mouth, but he didn't speak. Then, as if on cue, he grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the edge of the clearing, leading her into the thick brush. The man's voice grew louder. They were being hunted. She didn't look back. They ran, the branches slapping at her face, the ground uneven beneath her feet. Her heart was racing, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Suddenly, the trees parted ahead, and there it was, a road, a car. The stranger pushed her toward it. "Get in," he ordered. She didn't hesitate. She climbed into the car, slamming the door behind her. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, leaving the forest, leaving the man behind. But even as the car sped down the road, she knew this wasn't over. The car sped down the empty road, its headlights cutting through the night, illuminating the dark path ahead. Her heart was still racing, the adrenaline that had kept her going now fading, leaving behind a heavy, overwhelming exhaustion. She leaned back against the seat, staring out the window, her mind reeling. She had escaped, but she still couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking, just out of sight. Beside her, the stranger's eyes were focused on the road, his expression unreadable. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. The silence between them was thick. No words were needed, yet so many questions hung in the air. She wanted to ask him everything, to know why he had helped her, what had been going on all this time. But the weight of her own thoughts kept her silent. The miles passed in a blur, the hum of the tires on the road, the only sound between them. Finally, the stranger broke the silence. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft but steady. Her breath caught, and she turned to look at him. "Safe," she repeated, as if the word was foreign, something she hadn't felt in years. He nodded. "For now," he added quietly. Her eyes searched his face, but she couldn't read him. His calm exterior hid everything. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was a chance for her. Maybe she wasn't completely alone. The road stretched out ahead, the headlights now illuminating the small, distant lights of a town. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The shadows of the past would never fully fade. But as the car passed into the light, she felt a small breath of relief. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward, and that was enough for now.